Cheat on me during your bachelor party? Good luck explaining to your family why our $50,000 wedding was canceled last minute. I've always heard stories of lying, cheating husbands, but you truly never think it could happen to you until it does. All of this insanity happened in the past week, and I still feel like I'm living a nightmare that I'm waiting to wake up from. I was with my ex-fiancé for 3 years. When I met him, it felt like a dream come true, and he really seemed like my Prince Charming. We had so many similar interests, and he seemed like such a kind, sensitive man. He was always soft-spoken and seemed so different from any man I had ever met in my life. He was always complimenting me and getting me tiny gifts, and I felt so loved by him. He proposed to me a year ago at my favorite high-end restaurant. I cried so hard since it felt like one of the happiest moments of my life, and I never thought I would have been loved like that. Looking back, I should have known the relationship was too good to be true. He had never loved me, never. For context, I come from a very poor background, while my boyfriend's situation is the opposite. His parents are very well off, and when they heard about his proposal, they were thrilled and offered to pay for the entire wedding. I'll be honest, most women would probably have been overjoyed to have their wedding fully funded, but I never saw myself having a huge, garish wedding. I honestly don't even like big weddings, and I feel like they're more about appearances and materialism than the love of the couple. I truly only ever wanted a small, intimate backyard wedding, since I don't like organizing big events or being the center of attention. My future mother-in-law and sister-in-law took me dress shopping, but they shot down all the simple dresses I liked and insisted that it was my day and I should look like a princess. I just stopped giving my opinion after they laughed at my favorite pick, and I just let them choose dresses for me. Even though I hated them all. I felt pressured since their family was paying for my wedding, so I didn't put my foot down when they picked out a big fancy wedding dress for me that was totally not my style. I remember trying not to cry while looking at myself in the mirror, and just feeling trapped. But I loved my fiancé, and I knew his family was just trying to help, so I sucked it up and just went along with whatever they said. I was already beginning to dread my wedding, but I tried to stay focused on the love I had for my fiancé. Little did I know I would be losing that soon enough. My ex-fiancé's family arranged out-of-state bachelor and bachelorette parties for my husband and me. I didn't know about the specifics of the bachelor party, but the bachelorette party was just us getting a booth at a loud club. I didn't think about having a talk with my fiancé about boundaries at these parties. As I said, he was a loving man who I trusted with all my heart. I'm not an insecure person, and I could have never guessed what my fiancé would end up doing at his bachelor party, and I just wish I hadn't found out the way I did. Update 1. I explained in my first post that my ex-fiancé's family had offered to pay for our entire wedding, and they ended up steamrolling all the plans for it and left me with very few choices about my special day. I honestly hadn't even wanted a big wedding, and the closer our wedding date got, the more nervous I felt. His family had planned bachelor and bachelorette parties for us both, and I did not have a good time at my own party. My fiancé's family had only invited one of my actual friends. The rest of the girls there were women from my fiancé's family that I didn't know well. I spent most of the night missing my fiancé and feeling anxious that I might feel the same way on the date of my actual wedding. I felt awful and isolated that night. Little did I know it was only the beginning of the pain that awaited me. When I saw my fiancé again after our parties, something seemed so off about him. At that point, we had been together for years, and I could read his mannerisms better than anyone. For the week in between our parties and the actual wedding, my fiancé seemed nervous and sort of distracted. I had never really seen him like that before, and I kept asking him what was bothering him. All he said was that he was nervous about the wedding, but I had never seen him like this, so his behavior was really making me worried. In the days before our wedding, I was a mess. I was racked with anxiety over the huge luxurious wedding that I had never wanted, and I didn't feel stable in my own relationship. I remember thinking that I should have felt happy and excited before the wedding, but I felt the complete opposite. The night before our wedding, my fiancé had been acting weird all night and sleeping a lot of time on his phone. I was up in the middle of the night, unable to sleep because of my anxiety, and something just snapped in me, and I decided to check his phone to find some clues about why he had been acting strangely. I saw that the group chat that he had with his friends, which he used almost every day, was completely deleted off his phone. It was weird since I was sure they had been using it the weekend of the bachelor party, so I thought its absence was really suspicious. That's when I decided to look into his messages with his mom, who he is really close with. My world shattered as I read their conversation. It revealed to me that he had cheated on me at his bachelor party with a stripper. He had admitted what he had done the morning after the party to his mother over text. She scolded him at first but then immediately started comforting him. Ever since then, whenever he felt guilty, he would text his mom and say he had to tell me, and she would comfort him and convince him that it would be fine and to keep it to himself. She told him it would only hurt me, and that the wedding was all arranged and everything was paid for, and this wasn't a good enough reason to let everybody down. His mom had always been nice to my face, so I was appalled to see her so complicit in his cheating and his secrecy. I felt so destroyed in that moment, but part of me felt weirdly relieved. As soon as I found out about the cheating, I knew I wouldn't be marrying this man, and that this wedding was happening over my dead effing body. I sat there in bed, next to my sleeping, cheating fiancé, and tried to decide what to do next. Update 2. I had just snooped through my fiancé's phone and found out he had cheated on me with a stripper at his bachelor party the week prior. Even worse, his mom had been covering for him and telling him to hide the truth from me so I would just go through with the wedding. I remember looking at my sleeping, snoring fiancé, and wondering how dare he sleep so soundly as my heart broke beside him. After about an hour of thinking and planning, I knew exactly how I wanted to handle this. The single thing I had paid for out of the whole wedding was my fiancé and I's honeymoon trip, since I had wanted to stay in a nice resort in my home country and my in-laws didn't agree with my choice of location. So that night I bought an earlier flight for my honeymoon trip, and extended my reservation for a day earlier. I packed a small bag in the middle of the night, and thanked God that my fiancé didn't wake up while I was packing. I left for the airport in the middle of the night, knowing my wedding was planned for the very next morning. None of my family was attending the wedding since they all live overseas, so I texted my one friend who was my maid of honor and explained the situation to her. She understood and said she wouldn't tell anyone how to contact me or where I was. I got on the plane all by myself, and when we took off, I started crying for the first time since I found out about my fiancé's cheating. There was just something moving and liberating about knowing I was flying away from my fiancé, away from my in-laws. I was leaving behind all the pressures of the wedding and it felt right. The planning had made me feel suffocated for months, and I felt like a baby taking its first breaths as I cried alone during takeoff. When I got to the resort, I was still very emotionally vulnerable. I ended up trauma dumping by accident on the resort receptionist and quickly apologized for oversharing, saying I was just in a bad place and it was still very fresh. She ended up feeling bad for me and upgraded my room to the best room in the resort. I was lonely in the room all by myself, but my view was stunning, and I shut off my phone as soon as I put my stuff down in my room. I took the vacation to relax and recover. I journaled and cried a lot, and I decided when I flew back home that I would move to a new area and have a completely fresh start. Everything that happened was so painful and suffocating, but at the end of the day, I chose myself instead of caring about other people's expectations of me. I resent my ex-fiancé for cheating on me, but I'm grateful he showed me who he was before I committed to him and made the worst mistake of my entire life.
Oh, I am not a part of tries to take over my land and harass me, so I sent them a cease or desist and made them pay for damages. My parents owned about 30 acres of land in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, on the outskirts of town. They built their house in the late 80s and that's where I've lived my whole life. My parents passed away and I inherited the property. A developer bought up a bunch of neighboring land and wanted to buy my land. I told him I was willing to sell 20 acres furthest from the house. He agreed and we signed the paperwork, end of story, or so I thought. By the fall of last year, he had finished the entire area and there are about 200 homes in that neighborhood. Because of the neighborhood, my 10 acres are now worth about 10-20x what it was originally worth, and the HOA knows that. I've had a bunch of angry letters and citations left on my property and in my mailbox. Some of them include having a barn larger than 7 by 7 feet, I have a 20 by 40 barn, and having abandoned vehicles on my property. It's a project car shell that I'm working on. Then, having a non-conforming mailbox and improper roof tiles. I ignored them and told the HOA members that I'm not part of their neighborhood and therefore have no reason to follow their bullshit rules. The HOA says since my property values have gone up, I owe back dues from the date I sold my land and have to correct everything on the list. The back dues are currently $10,200, but they state that if I don't pay by December 31, 2017, I will be charged interest that has accrued. Again, no idea where they are getting the interest from, but I do believe their HOA fees are around $750 per year. It'll cost me about $15,000 to $20,000 to fix my house. I think it's absolute bullshit that they can even make me try to do so. I went through all the documents I signed and not a single document from the developer makes any mention of a HOA or my association with it. I have no idea why the HOA is coming after me. I live almost half a mile away from the nearest house that belongs to the neighborhood. The entire neighborhood has its own little custom street signs and lamps. I don't have any of that, so how can they say I'm part of the HOA? They said to either pay up or they will put a lien on my property and take it over. I had an hour-long discussion with the lawyer and he went through all the documents. He asked if I was sure that was every document and I told him it was. When I sold all the documents I put them all in the same folder along with my taxes. He says that there is no chance I'm in the HOA since I didn't sign anything. He let me know that he'd be glad to send them a cease and desist letter to the HOA. I also met with a real estate attorney who did the title search and I'm in the process of trying to find the old developer's master plans. We got in touch with the developer and he said he was no longer part of the neighborhood and in fact, the HOA is in charge of the entire area. His company just owned the lots and they sold/built on them for the families and they have zero say anymore. I asked him about the master plans and if he thought he owned my remaining 10 acres, and he said absolutely not. The entire neighborhood sits on old land plus the 20 acres that were purchased from in. So he was helpful and it was clear he had no wrongdoing. The title search and everything came up clean. It showed my parents as the previous owners and then me. So no way could they have owned my land. The records go way back, and there is a clear chain of ownership as my lawyer put it and it's incontestable. We sent an HOA a cease and desist letter as well to stop contacting me unless they have actual signed documents that show I was part of an HOA. They never got back to me. I was out of town and came back to my mailbox missing. It was cut clear off the post with a chainsaw. I told my lawyer this and he said that it was a big deal and that USPS would send the person to jail. Then I was away for the holidays and I came back to find my project car was towed out of my driveway, my pond was emptied and filled with gravel and sand, and a fenced off 2 acres of my property closest to HOA. I immediately called the police and filed a report regarding the stolen property. I had my lawyer draft up the C&D and send it to HOA. I hired a local salvage company to come tear up the fence, and they are doing it free of charge since I'm letting them keep the fence to sell as scrap metal or whatever they do with it. My lawyer suggested I send up a letter demanding payment to fix my pond as it was filled in with gravel and sand. A local landscape company quoted me nearly $8,000 to get the pond back to the way it was. The HOA board got a lawyer to respond to my C&D, and they requested a meeting ASAP with my lawyer present as well. At the meeting, I noticed the president and some of the higher-ups were not there. The board had no idea what the hell was happening, and their lawyer was just as confused as them. After I laid out my timeline of events, they thanked me for my time and accepted all the financial burden of replenishing my pond, missing car, and damages. I got checks for everything and got my pond restored. I found out a few weeks ago from the new HOA president that the old president and treasurer had been stealing money from the coffers. They wanted my land to expand and put in a pool and clubhouse, just as I saw on their website. The old board fined everyone a ton of money to get all the cash together and buy my land. Instead, they spent it on themselves. They needed my land somehow, so they thought they could just take over the land I wasn't using. Long story short, their entire plan fell apart after I fought back and brought to the other members of the HOA attention what they were doing. From what I've been told, they had to sell their house to pay back the HOA and have since moved away. My wife bought our daughter a horse the day after I had just lost my job, so I threatened to divorce her. Let me just start off by saying that I love my family and I would do anything to support them, but I have always struggled with anger issues, and I've always had issues at work with a-hole bosses. I'm not very good at managing my rage when I get pissed off, and I have come close to getting fired previously when I didn't handle conflict well at my place of work. Luckily, I have managed to stay at my last job for almost 7 years, but we recently had gotten a new boss in our department, and he was a total dickhead. He was so condescending and didn't really understand anything about the department he was running, and eventually, I just lost my patience with him. He had gotten mad at me for missing a deadline for an important client and started berating me in front of the whole office. That's when I had enough, and I got up and started yelling back to him in front of everyone. My boss doubled down, and we started screaming back and forth until I was eventually holding him by his collar and yelling at the top of my lungs. Now I understand that I lost my cool that day, but I had been managing my anger very well up until that point. If that man had never been hired by my company, this would have never happened. Unfortunately, I ended up being let go after that incident. I was extremely stressed out when I had to come home and tell my wife I had lost my job. My wife and I have been together for about 15 years, and it's not the first time she's seen me let go from a job because I flew off the handle on accident. We have a 16-year-old daughter together, and she is an excellent, well-behaved kid. She is on the lacrosse team at her school and a brilliant student who I am so proud of. About a year ago, one of her friends invited her to her barn, and she rode a horse for the first time and fell in love with it. She started volunteering at her friend's barn, and she and my wife started saving up to buy my daughter a horse. When I was still employed, I was supportive of their plan, and I always wanted to see my daughter happy. But as my daughter continued to talk about the barn and horse care, I started to realize that this was going to be an expensive endeavor. Before I lost my job, I knew we could handle the expenses of owning a horse since my daughter is our only child, and we have a lot of extra income after all of our bills are paid. My wife and daughter had finished putting the money together for the horse my daughter wanted around the same time I started having problems with my new boss. My wife and daughter had started looking at horses and falling in love with one in particular. They started arranging the sale with the horse's original owner and set up a date to bring her to a local barn where she would live under my daughter's care. I had never seen my daughter so happy and excited about anything, but I assumed that after I lost my job that my family would understand the new financial situation we would be in. I just thought that it would be clear as day that there was no way we could afford the horse after I had just lost my job. I assumed they knew that they would have to cancel the sale as soon as possible after I lost my job. Apparently, the sale was almost final, and the horse's travel arrangements were already in motion the week that I lost my job. But I still found it absolutely infuriating and ridiculous when I asked my wife if she had canceled the sale yet, and she said that they were still going through with it. I'll be honest when I say that I immediately started screaming at my wife, asking her how she could be such an idiot. I told her that my daughter was only a kid, so maybe she wasn't understanding, but my wife should have assumed that we wouldn't be able to take care of the horse after losing my income. My wife reminded me that the sale was already taking place before I had lost my job and that my daughter had a part-time job herself and would be contributing to the majority of the horse's expenses. My wife also insisted she could pick up an extra day at her own job if we really found ourselves struggling and that everything would be fine. I kept insisting to my wife that we didn't need this new burden over our heads and that she needed to find some way to get rid of this animal, because we could not afford it. My wife started to get very upset, and she said that she wouldn't take this away from our daughter just because I was a grown man who couldn't manage my emotions in any professional environment. This only made me more enraged, and I yelled at my wife for disrespecting me while I was already dealing with so much stress. I told her that if she ever spoke to me that way again, then I would leave her, and she would be responsible for destroying our entire family. My wife ended the conversation after this, and took my daughter out for dinner for a couple hours. When they got home, neither spoke to me, and my wife has been ignoring me since that day and sleeping on the couch. I have enough on my mind without her bullshit, and I'm just going to wait until she comes to her senses and speaks to me again. I have already made a post on Craigslist selling the new horse, and I'm not budging when it comes to getting rid of it. I think most people would agree with me when I say that there's no way I should be expected to pay for this thing while I look for a new job.
My two-faced future mother-in-law called me a SLT, so I called off the engagement. My fiancé was livid and cut her off of his life when she was begging for forgiveness. My fiancé and I have been dating for 4 years and engaged for 5 months. For some context about my fiancé, he is an outstanding partner. He is so kind and gentle, always ensures I feel secure in our relationship, and treats me like a complete queen. With all of that aside, the only thing that bothers me a little about my fiancé is that his mother and he have a bit of what I call an extreme relationship. What I mean by this is they are very extremely close, as it has been only the two of them since he was 8 years old. I have always been so nice to her and have done a lot during our whole relationship to spend time with her, help her with anything she needs, and try to become close with her. But unfortunately, no matter what I do, she always expresses she hates me and doesn't believe I will ever be good enough for her son because according to her, I am a gold-digging SLT. My fiancé on many occasions has stood up for me, but he isn't very stern or isn't really completely on my side. He just tells his mother to stop it or to not fight today, which makes me feel like he is dismissing it. This has been going on throughout our entire relationship. But one of those times, my fiancé really snapped at her and finally stood up for me. Which had gotten her to stop, as he threatened she would lose him if she didn't make things right. Before this happened, I had learned to put up with it because I love my fiancé and truly believe he is the one for me. But ever since he proposed to me 5 months ago, his mother has gotten progressively worse. She texts me horrible messages, leaves me voicemails, gets her friends to also harass me, and anytime she sees me in person she is terrible only when my fiancé is not around. She has resulted in being nasty no longer in front of my fiancé because of what he said the time he had stood up to her. 3 days ago, I called off the engagement and broke things off with my fiancé without telling him what his mother had been doing. I was scared to tell him because I knew he loves her and I didn't want to come between them again, especially when he has been so happy that we are finally getting along because his mother fakes being friendly and loving in front of him. He understandably was devastated and so was I. My fiancé has been calling and texting begging for me to talk. His mother sent me one text, to sum it up, and said, "I am glad you are gone. If I had known treating you like this would have made you leave my son sooner than I would have been this nasty from the start. My son will realize you are just a SLT and move on easily." I ended up telling my older brother why I ended things as well as my fiancé's best friend, as he and I are fairly close too. They both understand where I am coming from but told me I need to tell my fiancé because he will handle his mother and has been a wreck without me. As I have been without him too. They also said that I needed to stand up to his mother myself. So here's where I feel guilty and think I may be the a-hole. I finally called my fiancé and asked him to meet up. On my way to meet him, I texted his mother a long paragraph calling her a vile, disgusting woman and going off on her about all the stuff she has done. When I reached my fiancé, he looked incredibly angry. Apparently, his mom immediately called him crying, saying that I texted her saying I was going to beat her up and called her horrible names for simply calling me to make sure I was okay. Which obviously wasn't the case. Once I had told my fiancé what really happened, as well as showed him all the proof of what I said and what she had been doing for 5 months, he broke down crying and so did I. We both consoled each other and he profusely apologized for his mother's behavior. He blew up on his mother and immediately made no contact with her. He also uninvited her from our wedding. My family, my friends, his friends, and his aunt all were happy we were back together and proud of my fiancé for standing up to his mom and cutting her out of his life. My boyfriend gave me the ICK during a flight, so I broke up with him as soon as we landed. Let me start out by saying I know what I did might seem cold-hearted, but it's extremely important to me to have a strong, secure man as my partner. I'm sort of an impatient, unforgiving person, and I really only like giving people one chance and never looking back if they disappoint me. Anyway, all this took place when my boyfriend of a year and I decided to take a weekend trip to a warmer state. I love my boyfriend and we ended up having an amazing time. We laid on the beach and went clubbing and it was one of the most exciting, enjoyable trips I've ever taken. The problem didn't arise until after we were on our way home. I strongly believe that traveling together, especially flying, is a great way to test out the strength of your relationship since it can easily become a stressful experience. Well, we had some issues on our flight back since there was a hurricane in the area we were flying out of. Our flight was cancelled, then our new flight got delayed twice, so I was already tired and annoyed by the time we finally got on the plane. It turned out to be a plane ride from hell. It was storming as we were on the plane, and I could even see a huge lightning storm right next to the plane from my window. I have flown multiple times but I've never experienced something like this midair. At one point the storm got really bad and our plane started shaking with serious turbulence. It was so bad at one point a lady who wasn't buckled in was tossed upwards from her seat and hit her head on the ceiling very hard. This woman started wailing and crying and some other people started screaming and crying as well. The energy in the plane was very chaotic and scary. Yet like I said, I've flown before so I figured it would all be okay and I wasn't freaking out myself. But, when I looked over at my boyfriend, I saw that he had started crying too. Not just normal crying either, like full on. Little kid sobbing with a snotty nose and everything. Look, I know it was a scary experience, but he is a grown man, and in those situations, you need to stay calm or you'll make it worse for everyone. I didn't really feel bad for him at that moment since I felt like he was just making things worse for himself. I also feel like he should have been more mature and not freaked out so easily. I just put my headphones in and tried to sleep the rest of the plane ride, which was hard because the plane kept shaking for almost a half hour after that. I felt my boyfriend nudge me a couple of times, but I felt like if I looked at his tear-stained face I wouldn't be able to stop myself from cringing. When we finally landed and I opened my eyes, my boyfriend looked like he had literally been crying the entire time, and his hands were full of tissues. This was just the icing on the cake, and it felt like all my attraction to him just disappeared the moment I saw all those balled-up tissues. It was just pathetic. I knew the relationship was over before we even got off the plane. When we got to the baggage carousel and found our luggage, I just quickly walked away from him and called my own Uber. He looked confused and tried calling my name, but I just sent him a concise breakup text while I was in the Uber home. Again, I know this might seem heartless, but should I have really kept dating him after he had embarrassed me like that and revealed his lack of masculinity?
Grounded my son after he painted his nails. Now he hasn't spoken to me for an entire year. I love my teenage son, but I would be lying if I said I wasn't disappointed in the type of man he has been growing up to be. My son started developing a sort of alternative style ever since he was in middle school. It started with him wearing all black, but ever since he entered high school, he's taken his weird fashion extremely far, and I'm just not a fan. My wife doesn't seem to mind, but she's a pretty passive woman and has never been a very strict parent like me. If I were to describe how my son dresses now, he wears big baggy black clothing and lots of chains and rings. At one point, he was even dyeing colored strips into his hair. I remember being so upset the first day I saw this. It was just so embarrassing to see my child walking around like that. Now I don't have a problem with gay people or anything like that, but I never really wanted that type of thing to be a part of my own household. I've never confronted my son about his sexuality, and I really just don't want to know if he does happen to be gay. Our relationship is already sort of strained, and I feel like if I found out he wasn't straight, it would make it very hard for me to treat him the same. Like I said, I don't have a problem with gay people, I just don't want to be shoved in my face. On top of everything, ever since my son entered high school, he has made friends with mostly girls. At first, I was glad to see this, and I was happy that my son still might have a chance at growing up into a real man's man. But as time went on, I realized that he wasn't in a relationship with any of these girls. Instead, they were all just his close friends. He constantly has his friends over the house, and is part of a friend group with 3 other girls. To be fair, these girls have always been nothing but polite to me and my wife and are always respectful of our house. Still, it just rubs me the wrong way that my son doesn't seem to have many close guy friends, and I feel like it's not good for him to grow up that way. I tried my best to be non-judgmental towards my son, even though to me, he looked like more of a freak of nature every day the more he kept leaning into his alternative fashion. I didn't understand it since all of his friends were normal girls. He was the only weirdo in his friend group who dressed like some sort of 90s mall rat. When I look at him, he honestly reminds me of the kind of kids I would pick on in high school. Anyway, about a year ago, I ran out of patience with him when he came home one day with his nails painted a shade of bright blue. My son had never done anything like this before, and I couldn't help but feel overwhelmingly disgusted. I told him that he had gone too far with his emo bullshit and that I couldn't continue letting him make a fool out of himself like this. I told him that, at one point, he needed to become a man, and painting his nails made him look like some sort of weak tea. My son and I had never really been close, we didn't even speak that often, so he looked very hurt as I was telling him all this. But I couldn't help it, he had needed a reality check for so long, and there was no avoiding this conversation. I told my son to go get nail polish remover and remove his nail polish right there in front of me. That's when he started to get angry and said that he didn't have to change himself just to appease my Doomba homophobic self. My son has never spoken to either of his parents this way, and I knew that there was no way I was letting him get away with it. I yelled at him for cursing at me like that, and I told him that he would remove his nail polish immediately or there would be serious consequences. He said that there was nothing worse I could do to him than continue being such a hateful father, and that's when I lost my poop. I told him that I would ground him for the entire year if he didn't remove his nail polish within the next 60 seconds. He looked at me and told me that I could try, but I would never be able to control him, and that he hated me. He ran up to his room after this, and I followed through on my threat. I took his phone away and replaced it with a flip phone, and he wasn't allowed to go out or have his friends over anymore. All he did after that for the rest of the year was call his friends in his room and completely ignore me. One night I overheard him crying to my wife about how much he hated his life since being grounded, but all she said was that I was his father and he needed to respect me. I was proud of my wife for sticking up to me behind closed doors, and I still felt like I had made the right decision. I won't lie and say that it hasn't been a difficult year. My son stopped talking to me the day I grounded him, and I honestly do miss him. He graduates next year, and I just hope before then, he'll realize that I was only ever trying to do what was best for him.
Assume my husband is the one in charge? Lose out on a massive sale. Recently I received an extremely high promotion at my place of work. It came with a 70% raise and has honestly completely changed my life. I was born into a very poor household, and I never thought that I would be able to achieve stability like this. I'm 27 years old and my husband is 33. I've always looked on the younger side, and ever since we've been together I've gotten very used to people addressing him as if he is my caretaker or something. For example, a couple of years ago, we were applying for a home loan, and the male banker literally spent the entire time speaking to my husband without even making eye contact with me once. It really bothers me since I feel like people will often ignore me and treat my husband like he's more important or intelligent than me. It's something that has continued happening over the years, and even though I try to assert myself and stand up for myself, it never stops. This week, after receiving my 4th paycheck with my new salary, I decided I wanted to lease my very first car. I've always been interested in luxury cars, and with all this new extra income, I was finally at a time in my life where I could make this dream of mine come true. Ever since I was 13, I've always wanted a sleek black Porsche for myself, so the other morning me and my husband headed over to the Porsche dealership. I just felt defeated when we started speaking to the salesman, and he immediately started treating me like some kind of second-class citizen. Just like the banker, this man did not make eye contact with me even a single time. He didn't even go to shake my hand after shaking my husband's. Instead, he spoke exclusively to my husband even though he and I spoke up multiple times to say that I was the one purchasing the car that day. It was like the salesman thought we were joking or something, and at one point, he was patting my husband on the back and saying that a man like him deserved a car like this. The longer this interaction went on, the more disrespected and exhausted I felt. It would have been a six-figure sale, and I'm sure these dealership guys make a pretty good amount of commission, especially on luxury cars like this. I decided I really wanted this guy to feel hopeful while also wasting his time. So I pretended like we were interested in the car until the very last second, when I told my husband that I changed my mind right in front of the salesman, and we put the pen down on the paperwork and started walking out. The salesman was practically begging us on his knees to reconsider as we left his office. I just looked at him and told him that if he had actually taken the time to address the person who was actually buying the car, he would have made a sale today. He followed us out to the parking lot, still trying to convince us to come back in and buy the car. But I was done, and it felt good to roll my window up in his face as he continued to beg and plead for our time and money. My creepy father-in-law wants to drink my breast milk. Please help. I have a 7-month-old baby boy. I'm breastfeeding, but the baby is currently weaning. I'm convinced that my father-in-law is being weird about my breastfeeding and not in a that makes me uncomfortable way until yesterday. I made baby popsicles from my honker milk, and father-in-law put in the group chat that I'd love to try one of those with the hearts as eyes emoji. I said what the F they're made from breast milk, and he said he didn't notice that caption. Today I baked the baby some muffins. It's a recipe that called for a half cup of breast milk, so I made them per recipe. Father-in-law came over unannounced and said, "Oh yum, someone's been baking," so I told him those muffins are for the baby, they're just fruit, flour, and breast milk. I have a normal cake we can have. I then left the room to wash my hands and came back, and one of the muffins was missing. I asked my husband and he had no idea, so I asked father-in-law and he said that he ate it. I said that's disgusting. I told him they were the baby's and contained breast milk. He doubled down and said it's okay because breast milk is vegan. Note, no one in this story is vegan. I told him he was a creepy pervert and to get the F out of my house. My husband is baffled by the whole thing and was convinced it was a misunderstanding even though I explicitly said they're made with breast milk. Father-in-law said I'm a PP because I'd made loads and the baby wouldn't miss out. My mother-in-law was blowing up my phone until I asked her if she was really okay with father-in-law drinking milk that came directly from my breast. I think she didn't get the whole story. My sisters say it's fucking gross and father-in-law is a weirdo. I asked my husband what he thought I was mad about and he said he didn't realize that his dad actually ate the muffin. He thought I was pissed because he was messing with them. He also didn't remember the group chat incident but agreed that both incidents together were creepy. I called mother-in-law to clear the air and she revealed that father-in-law has always been very interested in lactation and she actually only fed her husband for 4 months and was always behind a locked door. Apparently, he moved jobs after a woman complained that he kept intruding on her pumping in a designated space in the office. I've told them father-in-law is not welcome around me and have asked for the key to our house back. I shared the concerns about him tampering with my milk and contaminating it, and also that if his own wife wanted him locked out then I'm entitled to that too. Husband said he won't be able to look father-in-law in the eye again.